For the CIO, though, this was not a very practical option. Why? Well, because for a craft union, you had to go through an apprentice process, which meant that you could control entry into the union. If you wanted to be a carpenter, you had to go through a long process of being an apprentice. How did you get to be an apprentice? Well, you had to know somebody, be a relative of somebody who was already in the union. That was a very difficult barrier, even if the union did not have an explicit bar to black membership. For the industrial unions, though, that is the factories, the steel factories, the automakers in Detroit, the meat packing industry, these were called semi-skilled workers, which meant basically you came in untrained, you were trained on the job. What did that mean for a union? Well, that means that if you go on strike, what can happen? The factory just decides to hire somebody else, bring them in, quickly train them, and with scab workers, now the factory is back in operation and the strike is lost. Oftentimes, who are the scabs? Black workers who need the jobs. So if you don't organize them, they will prevent you from achieving your goal. And what this meant also is that the CIO unions, many of them had communists as their organizers. Communists were drawn to the CIO unions because they felt that this was their way of achieving their goal of white and black working class unity. For many of the unions, their best organizers were young communists, both black and white. Well, Du Bois felt that the NAACP needed to become more involved in the union movement to counter the influence of the communists. Now, Du Bois's relationship with the NAACP reaches a crisis. I guess I shouldn't use that word since the magazine is a crisis. Reaches a crisis in 1934 when he publishes an editorial called Segregation. Has anyone in here read it far enough in the readings to know what was the cause of this break? Yes?
Walter White was upset that he felt that he was using the crisis to criticize the NAACP, and so.
But what was the editorial about? So, do you remember? Well, it was called Segregation, so that kind of gives you a hint. What was the, yes?
Was it that the NAACP should be doing more radical things to end segregation in America?
Okay, but it was a little bit more combative than that. He was actually saying that segregation is not always a bad thing. That the black community has to get its act together, has to, this is something that's often said today, that black people have to form their own organizations, have to build their own institutions. Ultimately, the goal is integration, but along the way, segregation might not be such a bad idea. Well, Walter White didn't want to hear that, and this was precisely the thing that they had always been worried about with Du Bois. Here is this independent voice out there. Who does he speak for? Is it Du Bois or the NAACP? It's the NAACP's journal. We didn't approve this editorial. And so Du Bois is forced to leave. He resigns. He says, "If I criticize within, my words fall on deaf ears. If I criticize openly, I seem to be washing dirty linen in public." So now he's 66 years old. Why doesn't he just retire? One of the amazing things about Du Bois is here's this guy, he's 66, he's been through all of this, he's the preeminent intellectual still. He has published the most influential book of the century in terms of African American life. He's a founder of the NAACP. The NAACP kicks him out. Why doesn't he just quit? Well, he's still got 30 years of very full life to live. And he goes to Atlanta University, gets back into his scholarly studies, founds a journal, Phylon, publishes Black Reconstruction, the most important book probably of that era in terms of the study of Reconstruction. Relaunches the Atlanta University Studies of African American Life, publishes another autobiography. He'll publish still another one later in his life, and gets right in the middle of all the controversies about World War II and the Cold War. But in the 1930s, other people are beginning to add their voices to the mix. For example, Black nationalists. Black nationalism had fallen into decline after the imprisonment of Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, but by the 1930s, that was one of the responses to the Depression.